Okay, looks like we've got a paired passage problem. Let's read text one, get the main idea. In 1916, Dugal-Sykes disputed claims that The Two Noble Kinsmen was co-authored by William Shakespeare and John Fletcher. So Sykes felt Fletcher's contributions to the play were obvious. Fletcher had a distinct style in his other plays, so much so that with lines with that the style were considered sufficient evidence of Fletcher's authorship. But for the lines not deemed to be by Fletcher, Sykes felt that the depiction of women indicated that their author was not Shakespeare, but Philip Massinger. Text 2. Scholars have accepted The Two Noble Kinsmen as co-authored by Shakespeare since the 1970s. Okay, so this differs than the above. He said way back in the early 1900s, Shakespeare was not co-authoring. It appears in all major one-volume editions of Shakespeare's complete works. Though scholars disagree about who wrote what exactly, it is generally held that on the basis of style, Shakespeare wrote all of the first act and most of the last, while John Fletcher authored most of the three middle acts, so on the basis of style. Okay, so we have style up here. So based on the text, both Sykes in text 1 and the scholars in text 2 would most likely agree with which statement. So they definitely don't agree on Shakespeare co-authoring this, but they both agree that Fletcher co-authored this or authored this. And that would be based on, it looks like, the style from both of them. So A, John Fletcher's writing has a unique, readily identifiable style. Yes, they use style to identify John Fletcher in both cases. That's going to be our answer. B, the women characters in plays are similar to the... No, we don't know anything about that, right? That's actually kind of false because they thought it was another author. The Two Noble Kinsmen belongs in one volume. It belongs. We have no idea if it belongs in a compilation of Shakespeare's complete plays. Obviously, text 1 would say it doesn't, but text 2 says it is. D, Philip Massinger's style in the first and last acts of The Noble Kinsmen is a homage to Shakespeare's style. No, there's nothing here that says he's paying homage to Shakespeare, right? The only thing that's consistent between these two passages that are disagreeing about Shakespeare is that Fletcher was the writer and he had an identifiable style. Okay, another paired passage. Based on the text, how would the author of text 2 most likely respond to the assertion in the underlined portion of text 1? Okay, so we have a good idea what we want to find here. Growth in the use of novel nanohybrids, materials created from the conjugation of multiple distinct nanomaterials, such as iron oxide and gold nanomaterials conjugated for use in magnetic imaging. Okay, this is a lot of a word sandwich. Conjugating is basically saying we're putting together certain materials that are nanomaterials and creating a nanohybrid from it. Has outpaced studies of nanohybrids' environmental risks. So what are they saying here? These combined or conjugated materials pose an environmental risk. Unfortunately, risk evaluations based on nanohybrids constituents are not reliable. Okay, so we can't assess the individual constituents, the parts, risks. Conjugation may alter constituents' physiochemical processes or properties such that innocuous nanomaterials from a nanohybrid, there's anything. Okay, so even if the materials that make it up are okay, the combination or conjugation could be dangerous. Okay, could be a problem. Okay. Text 2. The potential for enhanced toxicity of nanohybrids relative to the toxicity of constituent nanomaterials has drawn deserved attention. Okay, so it's deserved attention. There could be a difference, the author's pointing out, that we mentioned in text 1. But, now we're going to contrast, the effects of nanomaterial conjugation vary by case. For instance, here's an example. It was recently shown that a nanohybrid of silicon dioxide and zinc oxide preserved the desired optical transparency of zinc oxide nanoparticles while mitigating, that's reducing the nanoparticles' potential to damage the DNA. So that's good, okay? So actually, here's a good example. We were worried above about bad examples. Here's a good example. So what would this author in text 2 say about the underlined portion? Conjugation may alter constituents' physiochemical properties. I think he admits that, text 2. There's potential there. such that innocuous nanomaterial, yeah, he'd probably say it's potential, but here are some cases where it can do good as well. It goes case by case. So don't necessarily assume it's going to be bad. I think that's what text 2 would say. Okay, let's see what the answers offer. A, by concurring that the risk described in text 1 should be evaluated, but emphasizing that the risk is more than offset by the potential benefits. Okay, this is a good example, but is more than offset? He doesn't really say that. That's not right. Okay, he just gives one example where there are some potential positives out of the nanohybrid conjugation. B, by arguing that the situation described in text 1 may not be representative, but conceding that the effects of nanomaterial conjugation are harder to predict than researchers expected. Okay, here's harder to predict. This is our comparison. Harder to predict than researchers expected. Who knows what researchers expected? This is a comparative that often is a wrong answer. Okay. C, by denying that the circumstance described in text 1 is likely to occur. No, he doesn't deny it. That's not correct. He says there's potential. Okay, that's wrong. Not what he does. By agreeing that the possibility described in text 1 is a cause for concern. Yes, that was the whole discussion of the potential problem. But he switched gears and pointed out the nanomaterial conjugation does not inevitably produce that result. And it can't, because he showed a good example that was a different result, a more positive result. D is going to be our correct answer. So notice in this case, there's a lot of words and, word sandwiches going around. Who knows what conjugation of nanomaterials are and novel nanohybrids and what's going on here. It'll be very confusing for students. Again, if you can kind of cut through the fluff, you can get right to the core idea. That's the challenge. The core idea here is that text 2 basically said, yeah, that could be a problem, but in reality, it's not always a problem. It's case to case, and here's an example where it actually wasn't a problem. All right, we've got another paired passage. Africa's Sahara region, what do we need to find out? Based on the text, how would Chris Brearley, text 2, most likely respond to the discussion in text 1? Okay. So Africa's Sahara region, once a lush ecosystem, began to dry out 8,000 years ago. A change in Earth's orbit that affected climate has been posited as a cause of desertification. But archaeologist Wright also attributes the shift to Neolithic peoples. He cites their adoption of pastoralism as a factor in the region drying out. The pastoralists' livestock depleted vegetation, prompting the events that created the Sahara Desert. So in case you don't know what pastoralism is, you could probably make a guess. It's, having livestock and they eat up the vegetation as they are sort of cultivated. So I doubt it. I can't imagine that people were abundant enough that they could actually dry out the entire region. That doesn't even sound plausible to me, but that's my personal take as, I try to think these through. Okay, so text 2. Research by Chris Brearley challenges the idea that Neolithic peoples contributed to the Sahara's desertification. I would challenge it too. Using a climate vegetation model, the team concluded that the end of the region's humid period occurred 500 years earlier than previously assumed. The timing suggests Neolithic peoples didn't exacerbate aridity in the region. That means make it more dry and no longer vegetated. But in fact, may have helped delay the environmental changes with practices, selective grazing, that preserved vegetation. So his argument is, no, the people actually made it better and delayed the problem, which was ultimately caused by sort of global issues, a change in Earth's orbit that couldn't be controlled. So that's what this guy says in text 2. Okay. So how would he respond to the first one? Well, he'd say it's not true that, given the new information, it's not true that the Neolithic people caused the desertification. Okay. So by pointing out that given the revised timeline for the end of the Sahara's humid period, the Neolithic people's mode of subsistence, that was the pastoralism, likely didn't cause the region's desertification. Yeah. It didn't become a desert because of the people, right? And his new evidence and timeline helps support that case. I think that would be his response. Let's check B, C, and D. B, by claiming that pastoralism was only one of many behaviors that the Neolithic peoples took part in that may have contributed to the Sahara's changing climate. No, he didn't mention any other behaviors of Neolithic people. C, by insisting that pastoralism can have both beneficial and deleterious effects on the regions. No, again, he doesn't delve into the idea of whether pastoralism could be good or bad. In fact, he points out that their practices were probably helpful in this case. So, D, by asserting that more research needs to be conducted into factors that likely contributed to the desertification of the Sahara region. No, he's arguing quite clearly that the Neolithic people, given the new information, were not a cause of the desertification. He himself doesn't say that it was because of a change in the Earth's orbit, but he says it's definitely not the Neolithic people. Okay, we have another paired passage. And what do we want to find here? Based on the text, if Ishii and Mahoney, text 1, and Younger, text 2, were aware of the findings of both experiments, they would most likely agree with which statement? Okay, so this is going to be interesting. Soy sauce made from fermented soybeans is noted for its umami flavor. So we've got flavor, soy, and from it, it has flavor, which is umami flavor, okay? One of the 5 basic tastes along with sweet, bitter, salty. Okay, so this is a taste. That's what it is. Just like the core tastes on your tongue. Was formally classified when its taste receptors were discovered in the 2000s. In 2007, to define the pure umami flavor, scientists used broths made from shiitake mushrooms and kombu seaweed, and 2 panels of Japanese and U.S. judges closely agreed on a description of the taste. Okay, so they defined this umami flavor that was coming from the soy sauce, which is made from fermented soybeans. Okay, text 2. A 2022 experiment led to a greater understanding of soy sauce's flavor profile. So this is going to be more about the soy sauce flavor, something we didn't know, but it's not contrary. It's still along the same lines. The team initially presented a mixture of compounds with low molecular weights to taste testers, who found it was not as salty or as bitter as soy sauce. Okay. Further analysis of soy sauce identified proteins, including dipeptides, that enhanced umami flavor. So they found some things that boost the flavor of umami. They found boosters, something that improves the flavor that was first identified back in 2007 and contributed to the saltiness. The team made a mix of 50 chemical compounds that recreated the soy sauce's flavor. Their goal was to recreate the flavor. Okay, so if they were aware of the findings of both, what would they agree on? They would agree that umami is a flavor and it does derive from soy sauce. Let's see what else. Let's see what the answers actually indicate for us. On average, the diets of people in the United States tend to have fewer foods that contain certain... No, this is not about the diet of people in the United States. There's nothing about that is even in the passage. Either one. B, chemical compounds that activate both the umami and salty taste receptors tend to have a higher molecular weight than those that only activate umami. So only umami versus umami and salty comparison. Again, these false comparatives. That is not really mentioned in the passage, not a main idea of either. C, fermentation introduces proteins responsible for the increase of umami flavor in soy sauce. And those proteins also increase the perception of saltiness. Not sure about that. So they do mention fermentation up top, and it's noted for the umami flavor. They say it's a separate taste than salty, so I'm not sure about that. We can have these proteins, and they do enhance umami flavor in the second text and contribute to the saltiness. Maybe that's a point they'll agree on. I don't. It doesn't jump out at me. Let's check D. The broths in the 2007 experiment most likely did not have a substantial amount of the dipeptides that played a key part in the 2022 experiment. I think that's probably correct. So the 2022 experiment enhanced our understanding of flavor. And why? Because they use these proteins they call dipeptides to enhance the flavor, which was identified. So that's the new information in the 2022 study. So they probably didn't have that available in the early 2000 study. So this is not clear. This seems to be true. The broths of 2000 experiment mostly did not have a substantial amount of the dipeptides that played a key part in the 2022 experiment. Yeah, if they did, they would have been able to enhance the flavor and possibly recreate soy sauce themselves back in Text 1, 2007, but they didn't. So I think that is fair to say that both would agree with that. D is the correct answer. Okay, we've got another paired passage. Astronomer Mark Holland, let's see what we need to find. Based on the text, how would Text 2 most likely characterize the conclusion presented in Text 1? All right, let's see what that conclusion is. Astronomer Mark Holland colleagues examined 4 white dwarfs, small, dense remnants of past stars, in order to determine the composition of exoplanets that used to orbit these stars. Studying wavelengths of light in the white dwarf atmospheres, the teams reported that traces of elements such as lithium and sodium support the presence of exoplanets with continental crusts similar to Earth's. So they checked the white dwarfs to see if there were certain materials there that would make up a crust like an Earth, what we call an exoplanet. And they found it, and therefore they think there are exoplanets around those white dwarfs, kind of like Earth, with crusts, etc. Okay? So that's their conclusion. They found potential exoplanets. Text 2. Past studies of white dwarf atmospheres have concluded that certain exoplanets had continental crusts. That's exactly the study from Text 1, right there. That was the study. Okay? And their conclusion. Geologists blah, 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 argue that those studies unduly emphasize atmospheric traces of lithium. So these guys don't believe those studies. They're questioning whether they're even correct. They unduly emphasize traces of lithium and other individual elements, which is exactly in Text 1, as signifiers of the types of rock found on Earth. So they obviously think they're not signifiers of rock on Earth, or might not be. The studies don't adequately account for the different minerals made up of various ratios of those elements. Meaning these elements might make up rocks like on Earth, but they might make up something entirely differently as well. And the possibility of rock types not found on Earth that contain those minerals. So we may have different rocks. They might not even be a crust or a continental crust. Those materials could make something else. I think that's what they found was an incorrect assumption in Text 1. So what would Text 2 say about Text 1? Unexpected, because it was widely believed at the time that white dwarf exoplanets lack continental crust. No, it's not a question of being expected or unexpected or surprised. That was not the gist of Text 2. As premature, because researchers have only just begun trying to determine what kinds of crusts white dwarfs exoplanets. Well, possibly premature. It's premature because we don't know if those elements actually made up crusts. But because researchers have only just begun, we don't know if they just began or not. That's just, I think, not in the passage. Trying to determine what kind of crusts white dwarf exoplanets have. This is, believe it or not, this is extreme. This assumes the white dwarf exoplanets have crusts. That's what we're trying to find out in these studies. So they're assuming it's true. You cannot make that assumption. So that's a wrong assumption. The very thing we're trying to test, they're assuming is already the case. That's not correct. Okay. C, as questionable. Okay. Yeah, definitely questionable because they don't agree that the presence of lithium means crusts, because it rests on an incomplete consideration of potential sources of the elements detected in white dwarf atmospheres. Yeah, so what could the sources of the lithium and the materials they found? It could be something other than rocks like the Earth's crust, is what they're saying. I think that's going to be our answer. That makes sense. D, as puzzling. So again, not just questionable, but sort of quizzical, odd. It's puzzling because it's unusual to successfully detect lithium and sodium when analyzing wavelengths. So no, they don't contest the methodology of studying, the use of analyzing wavelengths from white dwarf atmospheres. That's not in question here. C is the correct answer.